Hi there. Welcome to Boost Your Bottom Line Financial Tips Every Agency Needs to Know. I am Melissa Morris, founder and lead consultant at Agency Authority, where we help overwhelmed agency owners start scaling again. We show them how to maximize their team, maximize their productivity so that they can start maximizing their profits. I have joining me today Abby Gallo. She is the founder of Terrain Bookkeeping. Abby, do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me today. Yes, Terrain Bookkeeping, we're a small bookkeeping firm that focuses on working with marketing and creative agencies to help them understand their numbers, to kind of translate their invoices, their sales, their income, as well as their expenses into financial numbers that they can understand and that they can use to then boost their profitability of their agencies and ultimately live happier lives themselves.
Yes, and I will attest to that because I didn't mention, but Abby and her team are my bookkeeping service. We've been working together a couple of years now. Good bookkeepers are very, very hard to find. And I know a lot of agency owners right now are absolutely in agreement with me. And Abby and her team have been amazing, which is why I knew when I wanted to start having this conversation about helping agency owners maybe understand some of their numbers, start thinking about, like I said, we want to maximize profits, right? This is what we help them do, is get systems and processes in place to help agencies. And then the financial component, right? Starting to answer some of those questions. So what are some simple ways that an agency owner can start looking and understanding project profitability? Maybe what does project profitability even mean, and how can I start going about understanding this in my agency?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, profitability, oftentimes people focus on, the top line revenue, right? That's what you hear about online. You hear six-figure businesses, million-dollar businesses, and a lot of times people are talking about revenue, right? But you could have a six-figure business and a lot of it could be going out the door in expenses or paying your team, and you may not be taking home very much of that. So what we really look at is profitability. Of course, the agency overall, like the bottom line profitability of the agency, but you really need to look at each project or offer profitability as well. And so one of the key ingredients of having the calculation of the profitability is really tracking your time and your team's time. And I know I am really unpopular when I say that because no one likes to track time, myself included. But it's really the only way you can truly understand the profitability of your projects, especially when, agencies, the bread and butter of what they do is really in their team's time or in their own time, right? It's a service we provide. So the time is really one of the biggest costs. So what we recommend is first that agencies are tracking their time, their team's time by client, potentially by project, depending on how you want to break it down. There's lots of different ways to do it. There's free services out there. I use Clockify. It makes it really easy, but there are a number of them out there. And we recommend that the agency owners also track their time, particularly if you're smaller and you are doing work for the client yourself. Even if you're not getting paid per se by salary or on a regular basis, I recommend tracking your time and then assigning a value to that time. What would you have to pay somebody else to do that work? And factor all of that in. So the simplest way to do it is to just get an Excel sheet. This is what your client pays you each month, or however you have it for the project. These are the direct costs that you had. So any software you had to pay for directly as a result of that client. Maybe you are building them a website or something, you have some direct costs there. And then also your team's time. And taking all of those expenses out, what are you left with? And that's really the project profitability. And so you want that to be ideally at least 65 to 75% if you can of the what the revenue is, so that you have enough left over so that you can pay for all the rest of the things for your agency and including yourself. So
So share that percentage.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but that really stuck out me. Share that percentage again, because I have a feeling a lot of agency owners heard the percentage you just shared and were very surprised at the number they heard. So I want to reiterate what you think that percentage should be. So I have this top line number. This is what the client has paid me. I'm taking out my expenses, right? I'm taking out what I paid my team. What percentage should be left?
I like to shoot for 65 to 75. It may not always happen. Sometimes it can be more like 50. That's okay. But you do not want to go less than 50% when you're looking at your project profitability.
Right.
Because you do need to cover all of the other expenses for your agency. And so if you are paying contractors too much, if you're not charging enough, which is what we see a lot, then you're just not going to be able to cover everything else. And we see some agency owners get into trouble where they have a credit card, then they start putting things on the credit card and debt accrues, and it can get into a really dangerous situation. And we say, well, always look at the model first and what's coming in, and making sure that that is profitable and that your offers are profitable. Because if those aren't, then everything else is going to be thrown off.
Yeah, and there were two things that you shared too that I want to come back to also. And that was talking about this revenue number versus profit. And I think when we start looking at the definitions, we all kind of understand revenue, that's the top, profit, what is left, but really understanding how big that discrepancy can be sometimes. And I do work with agency owners sometimes where they're saying revenue has gone up. We have multi six figures, $500,000, whatever. I'm not paying myself what I should be. Right. Or there are months where I can't pay myself this month. And look, there's no shame in that, right? But it is an opportunity. For me, I'm like, this is a great opportunity then for us to start taking a look at what's going on behind the scenes. Are you just really inefficient? Or, as you were speaking to, are you paying team members too much and something's really out of alignment? Are you not charging enough? That's an indication that something is out of alignment when we have this great top number, but when we're looking at the bottom, we're not getting paid enough. So that tells us something is going on there. The second thing that you spoke to that I am obsessed with is time tracking. And I could not agree more. I think there is such value in understanding where your time goes. And I think having that also starts to guide our pricing so that we know we're charging. We know how much we have to pay a contractor or an employee, or what that starts to look like. And having that data is really valuable. So we actually did a couple of Facebook Lives on these over the last few weeks. So we'll link to those. So if you have questions about time tracking, go back and look at those. And then let's talk a little bit more. You were talking about, okay, we have project profitability, client, but then we also have agency profitability. And these are two different things. And so we can have a service offering maybe that's not very profitable, but the agency still is, vice versa. So talk to me a little bit more about how you go about figuring out that, and maybe what our agency owners need to be focusing on first. Should I be looking at the project? Should I be looking at the agency as a whole? And maybe offer some tips there.
Yeah, sure. So I think depending on your business model, it can be tricky to evaluate all of the projects all of the time, right? I think when you have a retainer model, it can be a little bit easier to, track per client what you're spending for hours and all of that, and then calculate the profitability. On a project basis, it can be helpful to go and look at it on a quarterly basis, right? Start there, or on a semi-annual basis, and really take a look at a sampling of projects and see where you are with your time and if you are really profitable on those. Because like I said, I think that's the first place to start. But I think most of us tend to look at the whole picture overall. That's sort of the easier thing to look at. We have QuickBooks set up so that you can see the agency profitability, and what percent that is, what profit margin that is. And so that's sort of the easiest thing to look at. I think depending on your business model, that will determine what your profit margins should be, really. I mean, agencies, I think, should shoot for at least 20% profit margin if they are taking a salary. If they're an S corp or C corp. If they're an LLC and they're taking owner's draws, that profit margin should be a lot higher. It should be at least 50%, ideally higher, right? Obviously, the higher your profit margin, the better. But you have to weigh everything in terms of, would you rather do a lot of work yourself or have a team to support you and take some of that burden off your shoulders? So there's always a balance. When I say these numbers, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's more of a guide to just give you a perspective on, maybe, like you said, an opportunity to recalibrate, right? So
yeah.
And
I love how you said, okay, let's just start with the agency as a whole. Our bookkeeping report should be showing us that as a whole, starting to understand that. Do you often say, are there some things that we might see in that report that tells us we need to dig deeper and look more closely at a per service offering? Or is that something that maybe is a little more intuitive and you should be consulting with your bookkeeper on when? Tell me a little bit more about how we can look at agency profitability and use that as a barometer for some of our clients and projects.
Yeah. So I think when you look at those reports, if you aren't getting the profit margin from your bookkeeper, because that's not something that all QuickBooks is set up automatically to do, but you can have someone pull the profit margin number. So I would say ask for that on a regular basis, or ask that to be included in your reports if it's not already. And so that will kind of be a first indicator. And then the other part of this is to ideally have your direct costs broken out. So there's a section in QuickBooks called cost of goods, where you can have your team member costs and your direct costs for clients in that section. So you can see the profitability of your gross profit margin, which is basically when you take your revenue and subtract those direct costs. And like I said, in a perfect world, that would be 65, 75%. The higher, the better. And so that's another indication. If you're not seeing that overall across your clients, that profit margin or around that ballpark, then it may be time to dive into individual projects and take a look at the time tracking. We have some clients who set up, there are softwares that help you do this. There are some clients that have even just an Excel sheet to say, like I said, the sort of that formula of this is the client revenue, these are the expenses, and then they track it each month for the hours that their team has spent and therefore what the cost is. So you can sort of track that profitability percent for client or per project on a regular basis. So it's a good way to kind of keep tabs on that. If you can have somebody else on your team plug those numbers in, it's easier for you, to just take a look at it on a regular basis and check in on those numbers. But yeah, I would say obviously for agencies, the biggest costs tend to be their team, and software subscriptions is another big one. Sometimes rent and things like that. But those are the biggest costs. So I would just take a look and see how much you're spending on those things and as a percentage of your income. Because you don't want them to be too high.
That's great advice. And one thing, and I don't want to go down like a tax rabbit hole, because that is so state specific, S Corp, LLC. I know that is so individualized to, I think even make some conversation about that would be tough. But what I do think could be helpful is when we're talking about revenue, profit, where are we accounting for the tax burden? Where do we see that, right? Do I do revenue minus expenses? I have my profit, right? Where does the tax component fit into that? Because I know that's a point of confusion for a lot of agency owners.
Absolutely, yes. Great question. So for most LLCs and S Corps, the tax is on the balance sheet. So you won't actually see it on your profit and loss statement. You will see, it's basically you have your profit, and then from there you take your owner's draws and taxes come out. So that's partly why you need that higher profit margin to be able to cover those other things, right? So you take your funds as an owner after that profit percentage. So you need it to be higher to be able to pay yourself enough.
Right, which is where we were coming in with some of those percentages that I know
Yeah.
some agency owners were thinking, gosh, that seems really high. Well, this is why, right? We need to make sure there's room left for us for taxes, these sort of things. So this is having us then think about how is there enough money left? We need to make sure we're charging appropriately. So digging into time tracking. I think doing some competitive research, right? I think there are a few things agency owners can do to really dial in a solid pricing strategy for their agency, but also making sure you're paying your team appropriately. And this is a mistake I often see agency owners make, where they really are overpaying contractors, sometimes even employees, or they're hiring an employee probably a little prematurely and they really should have waited. So what are some tips? What is your advice around trying to dial in what is an appropriate fee to get the work done?
Yeah, I think in part it depends on how much work the contractor is doing. Are they doing everything from soup to nuts, or are they doing a small portion of it? But ideally, you don't want them to be making more than 30 to 50% of your client revenue, right? You don't want them to have more than that, because you need the rest left over to cover all of your other expenses, right? If you're bringing in $100 and you're paying them 80, you're really not having enough to pay for all your software expenses, your rent, and all the other things that you are responsible for as the agency owner. And you're the one usually going out to drum up the business and all of that. So do they really deserve all of that as well? Because you are putting a lot of work into getting the client, retaining the client, and all of the back end stuff that comes as being an agency owner, and the risk that's involved with that, right? So we like to say, between 30, no more than 50, because then you're cutting yourself off at the knees and not having enough for everything else. So that's usually my recommendation.
And I'm thinking we're getting to that higher end of the 50%, probably for those more strategic roles, like you mentioned. So a 30% would be someone who's probably doing more of a support role, or doing tasks and has a skill set that isn't quite as experienced. But then if somebody really is playing a strategic role, they're looking more like that 50%.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I think you have to take a look at how much they're taking off your plate, what portion of it they're truly handling, of the project.
And then we would be pulling those percentages from our agency billable rate. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And in terms of an agency billable rate, do you have any recommendations on how an agency can arrive at what is a good billable rate? Because this is something else that I work a lot with agency with, and we have a range. And I know this can also feel to a degree individualized based on some of the pieces of their business. But what are some questions maybe that an agency owner can ask themselves? What are things they can look to start guiding them in the right direction to finding an appropriate agency billable rate?
Yeah, I think your point about looking around at competitors, asking around, also considering your experience and how much time you've had in the industry, the types of clients that you work with also is a very big factor, right? If you're working mostly with corporations, it's going to look very different than if you're working with small mom and pop businesses, right? So I think those things all come into play. We usually don't, advise on a specific rate across the board, but I think it's like you said, it's kind of taking what you've seen from around competitors around the space, and then honing in on what your audience is willing to pay, and what you can then use to deliver on. And you need, like I said, you need enough to be able to cover the rest of your expenses. So in some ways, you can kind of start with a number and then work backwards and figure out, does this give me enough to cover all of the things that I need to do to run this business? And if not, then consider increasing it, right?
Yeah, and we've also done work with agency owners where we have them work through, use your time tracking data, know what you pay your current contractors, and map all that out and see how much does it actually cost you to execute on this program or service offering. It's going to cost me, for super simple numbers, $1,000 to pull this off, to pay my team, to cover the expenses, cover any pass-through costs. It's going to cost me $1,000. Okay, well, if I'm paying would then I kind of plus that up and say, okay, well, then I need this to be between like $2,000 and $3,000 as a service offering. So then knowing this is what I need this to cost in order to make sense for me to deliver the service. Now let me go see if people will pay it. Is this what other people are charging? Are they charging a lot less? That's a red flag. I need to start reevaluating. Am I paying the team too much? Are we just really inefficient at this offer? Do we need to tighten the scope? Or, oh yeah, other people are paying 35 or $4,000 for charging that out as a monthly fee. We're good. Like, we can absolutely start at that 3 to 35 and go from there. So I think when, again, it comes back to understanding your numbers, having those time tracking, having these data points, because it really does help you make a lot of decisions in your agency and really work to improve profitability.
Yeah, I mean, we've had clients who, I'm sure you've had similar experiences, but we've had clients where we've done project profitability and looking at the numbers, and our client realized that she herself was making about $13 an hour.
Yeah.
And she thought, okay, well, this means I need to increase my rates, right? This is just not working. And she did, and her profitability has increased significantly. So I think just having that actual data, I mean, we can all guess, we can make assumptions on, what we think we're spending our time on, but having that data in there is really sobering sometimes, to say, okay, well, I guess I'm not working for free here, so we need to change something, right? And it really can give you the confidence to increase your price, because you have that concrete data to say, I can't do this for this cheap, right?
Yes. And it has been really eye-opening as well when we've worked with some agency owners, because they'll have this big client. No, that's our biggest client. Do you know how much they pay us every month? They're not going anywhere. We give them everything. And I pull those time reports and I start doing that math. And I'm like, this client is like $32 an hour for you.
Right.
And their jaws are like, what? What do you, no, they bring us all this money. I'm like, how much are you paying those contractors? Like, they're not, though. They're not. And then we look at this little mix of other clients, and, client B over here, you're billing out at $115 an hour, and client C, you're billing out at $107 an hour. And suddenly this big client that feels like they're paying all the bills is like an anchor client in the bad way. They have just like anchored you, like they are dragging you down. Like new way to look at the term anchor client, right?
Yeah,
like, is it an anchor client or an anchor client?
Right. It's such a good point, because you're missing out on an opportunity to work with clients that could be, working at a higher profit margin. So it's really a lost opportunity there, even though you think it's this big safety net, because you have this sort of guaranteed big client each month, but really you're losing out in the long run, right?
Definitely. Okay. And then we've talked a bit about contractors and figuring out how do we find a good rate for them, and thinking of this, 30 to 50% of billable rate, billing them out at 3 times. What about an employee? Because I've heard a little bit of a range as well on that. So what is typically a recommendation on, if I've brought, how much revenue should my agency have for each employee that I have?
Yeah, I think the recommendation is, it's like the full-time employee, you want like 2.5 times their salary, right? Of like the total cost of the employees. to be your revenue at least. So I think similarly, you want your team. When I say contractors, I'm kind of factoring in your overall employees too, and thinking about it as the overall percentage of what you want to spend on labor. So they could be contractors, they could be employees. You just want to make sure that what you're spending on your team to deliver the service isn't taking the majority of the revenue that you have, so that you can, cover everything else.
Yeah, so we can look at it then very kind of similarly when we're considering then what we're billing out. And then one thing I just want to point out, because I do think this is sometimes also where I've seen some agency owners get confused, is they're just thinking about like the paycheck component of the employee. They're not thinking about the additional benefits, right? Like the true full-time cost, the true cost of this employee. So I have seen that mistake as well. So, and I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, when we are working with agencies and figuring out whether or not, sometimes we help our clients figure out whether or not they have enough funds to hire somebody new. And we do suggest that they factor in an additional 12%. It's a little high, but it covers, those additional benefits, as well as additional administrative fees. Payroll costs a little more when you have more people. You may have some additional services that you provide them, or additional software costs that you have because you have another user, right? So we kind of ask them to add 12% to whatever they were hoping to pay them in salary to that overall budget line item, so that they can really have those added costs in there. Because if you're not thinking about that, those can sneak up on you, and you certainly don't want that. So we like to be a little cautious with that.
Yeah, I love that. And those software fees can be sneaky. It's an email, it's an extra Dropbox account, it's an extra Asana or ClickUp seat, it's an extra time tracking seat. Yes. The next thing you know, you're like, oh, this is like an extra 150 or $200 a month, potentially, depending on how many softwares, what tier you're on. It can get pricey, and you weren't expecting that.
Yeah, I think it's important. I've started advising some clients to just kind of start keeping track of that. Like, as you start bringing on new software, take a list and see, is there an additional cost for an additional user, and start calculating what it would be to bring on a new user for your firm, so that you have that number and you have just a sense of what that is at any given time.
Yeah, such great advice. Okay, so as we're wrapping up here, what are your final thoughts and recommendations for agency owners when we're thinking about the scary? I'm including myself in that. I'm always like, Abby, I don't understand. I'm scared. The bookkeeping numbers. How do we face those?
Yeah, I think it's overwhelming if you think about it, and you try and meet all these numbers. And I've thrown a lot of numbers out there, right? I think the most important thing is to just start looking at your numbers and start looking at your agency profit margin overall, the bottom line, all right? And that's really the easiest place to start, I think. And then you can, like we said, if that's not in alignment with where you should be, then it's looking at more of the details, right? And kind of diving in. And it doesn't have to be, you have to evaluate all your clients all the time, every month. It could just be a sampling, and it could just help you figure out, is that offer working or not, right? You don't have to do it all across the board all the time, because that's very overwhelming. And most of us probably won't do it or won't keep up with it, right? So I would say just start small, just start thinking about these numbers and these percentages. And as you're looking at your numbers, just kind of check in and see if you're kind of in those ranges that we mentioned. But that would be my greatest advice, but to not let it overwhelm you, because it can be confusing. And there are a lot of, there are a lot of nuances to your agency and all of that. So they're not hard and fast numbers, but they're just a guide to kind of let you check in with yourself and see where things are. So that would be my recommendation, is just to kind of check in occasionally at the bottom line profit margin.
Yeah, and I agree. I think even just starting and getting started, I think can start shedding a lot of light. And then to follow up to that, I would also say, have a trusted bookkeeper. Make sure you're getting the reports you need. I see this so many times. So many agency owners I know are struggling to find a good bookkeeper. They're not getting the reports they want. Their bookkeeper's giving a lot of pushback about giving them certain reports, certain numbers. And I see that a lot. So I do think finding a trusted support system in that, so that as you are starting to look more closely at profitability, these questions are coming up for you about what does this mean? Having someone trusted that you can send that email to, and they're going to give you a great answer back. They're not going to give you pushback about this, no, you don't need that report, or, oh, you don't need to look at this. In my opinion, and I think you've always showed up with this, if I have a question about my numbers, it's important to me. And that means it should be important to my bookkeeper. And I know I've asked you for in the past, like, help me understand this number, or I don't really understand this. And you've always been really great about that. So get started, and definitely make sure you have a trusted bookkeeper to support you. I think those are great advice. So if agency owners out there are looking to learn more about Terrain bookkeeping, where should they go?
Sure. I think probably our website is the best spot, or here on LinkedIn, they can check out my profile. But terrainbookkeeping.com, that would be probably the best place to reach us and learn a little bit more about us. But we offer free discovery calls, so we're always willing to chat and see if we might be a good fit for your agency, and if we can help you out and answer all these questions for you.
Yes. If you're looking for one, please reach out to Abby and her team. I can't say enough great things about them. And if you are thinking about this and you're starting to think time tracking, how much my team, and you're thinking about, oh gosh, all these data and all these numbers, and it might be maybe feeling a little overwhelming, I'd like to invite you to a workshop that I'm hosting on Wednesday, December 11th. It's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to talk about the KPIs that you should be looking at in your agency. And hint, one of them is your profitability and your project profitability and time tracking and all the things that Abby is saying you need to be paying attention to. So we're going to go through the things you should be looking at, and I'll have some templates and stuff to share. So make sure you check that out. You can go to youragencyauthority.com/workshop to sign up for that. Reach out to Abby if you have more questions about bookkeeping, or this is maybe a red flag for you went off and you said, I might need some backup here. Make sure you reach out to Abby. Abby, thank you so much for joining me today. This was so valuable, and I know a lot of agency owners learned a lot today.
Thank you, Melissa. It was really fun being here. Appreciate it.